Okay, good morning, everyone. Good evening for those people who are joining from other parts of the world. Thank you very much for joining Sixth Health Security Dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. My name is Hiromi Murakami of Global Health Innovation Policy Program, facilitating this dialogue series. And we're very honored to welcome a very distinguished guest today from New York, United States, Ms. Laurie Garrett, a greatly respected figure in our arena. And as you know, Japan continue to have second emergency status in metropolitan areas that are still struggling to make COVID-19 under control. For the US, this is also a difficult time as death toll passed 500,000, which is unprecedented number. On the other hand, the United States has accelerating vaccinations. That speed is much faster than Japan's. So we very much would like to hear how Ms. Laurie Garrett observe situation and beyond what we're experiencing today. The purpose of this dialogue series is to build a community for sharing knowledge and experiences and discuss how to best prepare for the future health crisis and build health resilience. Ms. Laurie Garrett will be sharing her view regarding presidents versus pandemicide. We'll have Q&A in the remaining time, and her longtime friend, Dr. Kurokawa, will be sharing his view later. For administrative announcement, please submit your questions in Q&A column on the bottom of the screen, even during the talk, so that we can address your questions appropriately. So let me introduce today's speaker, Ms. Laurie Garrett. She is a science journalist who won Pulitzer Award, and she wrote her first best-selling book in 1994, The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in the World Out of Balance, while she was a fellow at Harvard School of Public Health and the journalist at New York newspaper Newsday. I've read this book, and if you haven't read, I strongly recommend to read. This is a great book. And she worked closely with the Emerging Diseases Group, a collection of faculty concerned about the surge in epidemics of previously unknown or rare viruses and bacteria. During the 1990s, she continued tracking outbreaks and epidemics worldwide, noting the insufficient responses from global public health institutions in Zaire, India, Russia, and most of the former USSR, Eastern Europe, and the United States. This resulted in publication in 2000 of Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health. Both books are bestsellers and read quite widely. In summer 2011, her third book, I Heard the Sirens Scream, How Americans Responded to 9/11 and Anthrax Attacks, was published in time for 10th anniversary of September 11. Laurie is a member of the World Economic Forum, a Global Health Security Advisory Board. She is also a member of Council on Foreign Relations and the National Association for Science Writers. She helped create Noguchi Africa Prize and has 3 times served as its judge. Listed as a twice for Cassandra in Warnings, Finding Cassandra to Stop Catastrophes in 2017, Richard A. Clarke and R.P. Eddy, HarperCollins Publishers. Then we have Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa from GRIPS as a commentator. He is a professor emeritus directing Global Health Innovation Policy Program, and he has also long been involved in global health arena. He is a member of World Dementia Council, International Scientific Advisory Committee, and many other institutions. With that, I'd like to pass microphone to Laurie. We greatly appreciate that you taking time for us and sharing your view with us. All yours.
Oh, arigato, Hiromi. And konnichiwa to everybody. I will apologize in advance that I'm just so swamped these days, COVID, round the clock, that my remarks have been very hastily assembled. So I will beg an apology in advance. If things seem a bit sloppy or crazy, I'll do my best. And I will go now to the PowerPoint. And here we go. So as I said, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to all of you today. I want to begin in a place that might not make a lot of sense at first to those of you who are interested in global health and pandemic disease. Why am I starting off with the man who is arguably the greatest military mind in world history? Certainly our Pentagon thinks so. Sun Wu, who in ancient times wrote the very famous book, The Art of War. The reason I start off with him is because he defined the difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Overall, you think strategically, you act tactically. And strategy must define your long-term goals, how you intend to achieve those long-term goals, and create a sort of pathway to your future, what you are trying to accomplish. Tactics, in contrast, are a list of different ways of possibly contributing to that strategic set of goals and taking smaller steps. This would be your weaponry, your technology, your innovations, your planning. So in The Art of War, hence the saying, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And this is our battle, that against the COVID virus. Where do we stand when we think strategically? Another great strategic military thinker who was in the Prussian military under Frederick the Great is Claus von Clausewitz, who warned of what he called the fog of war. This notion that you enter a period of conflict with your enemy where everything is uncertain, where you see through this dense fog of mystery and uncertainty, false information and accurate information, trying to determine what is reality so that you act accordingly. Well, I bring all this up because we don't have a strategy. We are going into battle. We have been in battle now for more than a year against a very tenacious enemy, and we don't understand it, and we don't have a strategic goal, and we don't have a strategic plan. And when I say we, I mean not at the United Nations level, not in any international context, and not in any given nation. Perhaps Japan had a strategy. It was very much tied up with making sure the Olympics could happen. But you are being challenged and your strategy is shaken. On April 3rd last year, I was asked to speak to Antonio Guterres and the Secretary General's Special Council of Advisors about COVID, and what I thought, what I was recommending were the long-term pictures of where we were going with this epidemic. At the time, I noted that there were two major mathematic models that had been created, projecting from what was largely Wuhan data and just the beginning of data from Italy and the United States, chiefly our West Coast and East Coast. One data set was put together by Hong Kong University's Gabriel Leong, who predicted that 65% of the human population will eventually be infected with SARS-CoV-2, possibly as high as 80%. And he was thinking in roughly a 5-year timetable. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College in London issued a similar report, largely in agreement with Leong's projections, but erring on the conservative side of 65%, meaning 5 billion people would get infected. Depending on what you thought the case fatality rate was, that could be a huge number of deaths. If you assumed a fatality rate, which looked to be the accurate one last April, of 1%, that's 50 million deaths. That would equal roughly within the range of estimates of mortality for 1918 influenza and the European plus Middle Eastern losses during the 14th century plague. I said, this cannot be allowed to happen. And in my remarks, I said, look, we have a choice. We have two scenarios to choose from. Scenario one is the rich world takes care of itself. So China, Japan, United States, South Korea, Singapore, Russia, etc., would limit losses by doing very radical social distancing programs that would be very costly, very difficult to enforce, have crippling economic consequences, still have high death tolls, but keep them under control. And that is largely a strategy that assumes we're buying time until we have a vaccine. That multiple companies and countries would go into competition trying to be the first with a clinically proven vaccine. And then I thought this would take all the way out to the end of 2021. Fortunately, I was wrong. I was off by about 11, maybe 12 months. But that eventually there would be national rollouts in the rich countries financed by their national health systems and insurance schemes. And that by mid-2022, the majority of the Northern Hemisphere would either be naturally immunized by having contracted COVID or have acquired immunity via vaccination. The virus would cycle back and forth seasonally, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, and take a devastating toll on the Southern Hemisphere, which would not have access to these tools, so that there would be very, very severe consequences even as a vaccine was eventually available. In that scenario, I said, we are allowing SARS-CoV-2 to become endemic, a permanent scourge affecting humanity for generations to come, much as HIV did. It would be controlled ideally in the Northern Hemisphere, less ideally in the Southern. And the United Nations system would be saddled with yet another great burden, like HIV, like drug-resistant tuberculosis, that requires massive campaigns, huge movement of resources from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern, from wealthy world to poorer world. And it would be a permanent burden of a philanthropic nature, of governance challenge, and of course, of human health and mortality. And the second scenario would be that we stated as our strategic goal collectively as humanity that we're out to eradicate the virus. That we would begin back then when I was saying all this in April last year with a goal of creating a strategic plan to vaccinate 7.5 billion human beings. This would require that we would be thinking already last year, last March, April, May, about design of a vaccine, design of interventions that would be ideally implemented in poor countries and in resource scarce parts of the planet, so that we wouldn't go for something that had to be stored at negative 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We wouldn't go for something that required multiple syringes. We wouldn't go for something that would be logistically a nightmare to implement, but rather would consider nasal administration or oral, and target something that would be heat stable or at least room temperature stable for use all over the planet. The two most powerful nations on earth would have to put aside their animosities, their tensions, and combine their forces, China and the United States, much as the Soviet Union and the United States did during the Cold War, when they decided jointly to go for eradication of smallpox, a disease that we long forget about, but that killed more people in the 20th century than all wars combined. That is a phrase that now we can say about COVID. We couldn't have imagined that when I was saying these remarks in April of 2020. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to push such a scenario at that time. We were already looking at tremendous scarcities of resources and dangers in the global economy brought by the arrival of COVID. And indeed, by December, we had a world poised for tremendous economic advances. We were going to get rid of all extreme poverty on the planet. The Dow was exploding. All the major markets around the world were on the ascent. The S&P 500 grew 28.9% in a single year. All over the world, the stock markets were soaring. Investors were happy. As December was coming to an end, it seemed that the entire planet might simultaneously be marching into the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, with real wealth and real money to support this. This despite coming back from 2008 and from real challenges to the global economy. We had seen net growth all over the planet, including in sub-Saharan Africa, in some of the poorest countries in the world. And this was despite a very bitter trade war that was already creating great tension between the United States and China. But in the background, we were ignoring that we had seen a steady climb in the emergence of previously unknown or newly recognized diseases, most of them originating in animals and zoonotically transferring to human beings. And that we'd been issuing warnings since the 1980s about this that largely had gone ignored, except during periods of outbreaks such as the 2014-15 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, or the 2009 H1N1 swine flu. But except in these brief flurries of concern, the world was largely paying no attention whatsoever. And development assistance for health reflected a very, very minor level of concern about emerging diseases and pandemic preparedness. It was a sliver of the overall global health and development assistance budget all over the world. And WHO's budget couldn't even compare to the budget for one hospital in the United States, New York Presbyterian Hospital, and certainly couldn't match the budget of our Centers for Disease Control. So we were ill prepared for what was coming. We weren't acknowledging that it would come outside the we that is the global health subpopulation that is worried about these things, and we were ill prepared. By July 2020, COVID had brought the global GDP down by 6.3%. United States was down by 7.9. Eurozone was down by 8.8. China was in a negative deficit for the first time in decades. Sub-Saharan Africa was rolling backwards, and world trade had all but ground to a halt. We had shortages and supply deficits all over the world. The OECD was warning that the world economy could collapse. It was being compared to the Great Depression of 1929. It was being called a pandemic depression. And Lawrence Summers and Gordon Brown from the UK, the former Exchequer and the former Secretary of Treasury, jointly wrote a document published in the Journal of the American Medical Association calling it the $16 trillion virus, issuing their projections for massive losses still ahead. And this was published in October of 2020. There was a sense of great economic doom as the pandemic went into surge after surge. We are now facing the great possibility of the fourth surge in North America. And of course, this resulted in massive unemployment all over the world, including in the richest country in the world. Well, way back in 2019, a joint report was issued from the United Nations that said we will have an apocalyptic pandemic. And this report was largely ignored. It was issued by Gro Harlem Brundtland, jointly funded by WHO and the World Bank. And I think outside of Antonio Guterres' office, nobody read it. And as I said, we had a real struggle going on between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump that pitted them against each other already rhetorically in numerous ways. Xi Jinping's government really ignored what was emerging in Wuhan early on. And there was an attempt to put on a show, really, to say we've got it under control. There's nothing for the world to worry about. Pay no attention to those people behind the curtains that are all cadavers lined up. The security state was put in, and we could watch in real time. If you were watching Weibo or other Chinese social media, you could watch postings put up by doctors, and they would just disappear right in front of your eyes as you were watching Chinese media. You could see people being censored. You could see journalists disappearing in the end of December and all through January and into February of 2020. On the American side, Donald Trump acted as if pulling up a drawbridge would protect the castle from the raiding hordes. So, you know, we'll shut down a few flights from China, and my good friend Xi Jinping has got the situation under control. There's nothing to worry about. He insisted that there was no concern for the United States of America and utterly ignored fairly scarce security reports sent over to him by CIA and our National Security Council. He also refused to grasp any of the scientific ideas that were beginning to surface, offering great concern, which by April was a screaming chorus of scientists from all over the United States, multiple fields, saying, "Mr. President, we have a crisis." And this was entirely ignored. China's incompetence endangered the world. You know, just on the eve in December, they had these posters all over China that said, "Be patriotic, do not wear a mask," so that their artificial intelligence facial recognition programs, police, could capture your image. Leong famously, with 7 other colleagues, on December 29th warned that they had seen 27 bizarre pneumonia cases, that it reminded them of SARS, and that all the doctors in Wuhan should be on alert. Stay tuned, this looks very dangerous. They were immediately ordered to shut up. Though the Wuhan government did release on December 30th an unexplained pneumonia announcement, they were very absolutely certain it was not a coronavirus, it was not SARS, it was just some kind of pneumonia. And Leong and his colleagues were severely chastised by the police and detained for spreading false rumors and for any mention of SARS, any analogy, forced to sign confessions that they had sinned by raising these concerns. Leong's colleague, Dr. Ai-fen, posted on social media some of the radiology and microbiology reports showing that there was something to worry about. So the government said, well, okay, it's all about an animal market, and we closed the animal market, and now that it's closed, the problem is over. So this all just came out of a wet market, akin to the one that I photographed in Guangzhou in 2003. This is where SARS came from as it leapt from civets to humans in southern China in the fall of 2003. These wet markets, of course, are massive. Anyone who's traveled in China and has visited them knows every imaginable species is there. They are alive. They will be purchased alive and slaughtered in restaurant kitchens or in the home. And whatever they carry, this civet, for example, carries, may be transmitted in the process of their butchering for consumption, often in exotic food restaurants. Well, Xi Jinping posted the sequences of this new virus on January 2nd and said it resembles SARS. And within a matter of days, the reports started getting out that a SARS-like phenomenon had indeed emerged, whether from the market or from somewhere else, that there were multiple clusters and that they weren't all connected to this animal market, that in fact, there were clusters that seemed to have nothing whatsoever to do with this animal market. It was continuously called extraordinary pneumonia, and it was on the cusp of the Lunar New Year, when, as is well known in China, they have a massive amount of social interior movement from one part of the country to the other. Wang Guanfa was insistent on national television on behalf of the CCP and the medical community that there's no human-to-human transmission. There's nothing to worry about. This is all completely under control. And in fact, the Communist Party will in Wuhan go right ahead on January 18th and have its massive 40,000 family feast. But Zhang Nanshan, a national hero in China for his discovery of the SARS virus in 2003, investigated on site and reported back to Xi Jinping on January 15th. There is definitely human-to-human transmission. There are definitely cases that have nothing to do with this animal market. We definitely see a high mortality rate. And despite the closure of the market and all the measures the Wuhan government has taken, this is continuing to spread. It's out of control, and we need assistance in Wuhan immediately. As the lunar holiday approached, Xi Jinping took control. He fired most of the leadership in Wuhan and Hubei and sent in his cronies from the Communist Party in Shanghai to take charge of the situation in Wuhan. And for the first time, they started to report a surge of new data on January 20th, the beginning of decent numbers reported to WHO. And it was the first time WHO realized how massive the outbreak actually was in Wuhan, how much had been missed. And in a single day, their reporting numbers quadrupled the scale of the epidemic. From then on, case counts started doubling every single day, and Wuhan was utterly overwhelmed. But nevertheless, there was a tidal wave of humanity going from Wuhan all over the nation, more than 5 million from Wuhan alone, taking the virus with them from to Shanghai, to Beijing, to every corner of China. On January 31st, Leong was hospitalized, having acquired the virus from one of his patients, and he would shortly die of the disease. Almost overnight, on January 25th, Xi warns of an accelerating epidemic, and the nation goes into lockdown. We have never seen anything like the lockdown that then proceeded to unfold in China. And though many nations have had lockdowns subsequently to deal with COVID, none have had anything at the scale of what China did from roughly January 25th until the end of February. The security state locked down on information, and all data, all information was very tightly controlled. Roads were shut down, roadblocks were set up all over China. The military was mobilized alongside police to take control of the situation on a scale unprecedented. Whole entire highway systems were locked down. Military personnel were added to the hospital personnel in order to deal with the massive numbers of patients flooding hospitals all across, not just Wuhan, but city by city across China. Food supplies began to run out. Stockouts were severe, and there was a shutdown of most travel. It was a dramatic situation with a huge burden on the healthcare workers themselves. Eventually, Li Keqiang came in personally, the vice premier, to lecture the healthcare workers, tell them they must obey their duties, they must stay on the job no matter what. You started to get leaked reports of even larger numbers of cases and deaths, which the government would instantly cover up. But they showed that there was fear, and it was spreading all across the nation. Finally, on February 6th, Leewan dies, and the government tries to cover up his death and issues reports saying, no, he didn't really die, but he did really die. And his death sparks a huge outpouring of sympathy and tragedy all across the nation. It shakes all of China up. There is a sense in the medical community and among social media users that he is a national hero of the moment, that it was his action that prevented an even greater catastrophe in Wuhan and all across the nation. And we began to see the epidemic start to come under control as it goes from China leading the world in cases to a flip in the situation, if I may show you. So this is a little blurry. I pulled this off social media, but China is the top bar, and you can see, well, there's Japan. You can see how it changes over time. Let's see if I can display this. So this is January 20, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. We're heading into February. Now Japan has the highest number because of the Princess cruise ship and the situation with the cruise liner. That will drop down quickly, as will the Thai and Singapore situations. And soon we'll begin to see, as we go into February, a complete shift from Asia to Europe and North America. First, we see rising numbers in Germany, but the Germans bring them under control pretty quickly. The United States insists, the president insists there are only 15 cases in America, but America is not actually testing. So these are only symptomatic cases that anybody's even noticing. There's no mass testing or efforts to test. As we go into February, the South Korean outbreak becomes the #1 concern. The whole world has their eyes on it, but pay attention to Italy. Very quickly, Italy is going to overtake everybody. And as the distribution of cases shifts, it's shifting. What's interesting, these are countries that allegedly were among the best prepared for a pandemic in the whole world. These are countries that had all passed WHO inspections, all proven themselves to be among the best prepared other than Iran. This Iranian outbreak is associated with religious group, as is the South Korean. In South Korea, it was a religious cult that refused to cooperate with the government in providing information. And in Iran, it is a series of imams in a religious pilgrimage site refusing to shut down the mosques and the huge numbers of pilgrimage travelers coming in. Now we will begin to see Spain. And of course, if we continued on with that, we would see the Italian and North American epidemics. And why did this freeze? And here we go. Right, so as I said, once it begins to slam the United States, the president refuses to listen to scientific advisors, and our cumulative test case load just soars. One spring version, and then summer, then autumn, and now here we are facing the real possibility of a fourth surge. We were quite happy that our holiday surge, which was hideous, which began actually on Election Day, November 3rd, and went through our Thanksgiving holiday of late November, our Christmas holiday, and our New Year's holiday. All of them times of great travel, of people meet and greet with friends and relatives, spreading the virus. And as that finally played out, and we began to see the arrival of the first vaccines, our surge had been coming down. And with the election of Joe Biden to the White House, we had a very different response to this epidemic, a very coherent, clear, decisive response, deploying from every imaginable agency, not even just the traditional public health agencies, and a great deal of optimism. But we were all nervously watching the UK when the B.1.1.7 variant emerged in December and caused an enormous surge that they're still fighting their way out of in the United Kingdom. And of course, as everyone knows, the B.1.1.7 appears to have a spike protein mutation that renders it more contagious, more easily transmitted from person to person. not long thereafter, it was recognized that a second, much worse variant had emerged in South Africa, and it has rendered the AstraZeneca vaccine utterly useless. And they have now purchased the Johnson & Johnson brand new vaccine, just approved this weekend here in the United States by our Food and Drug Administration. It appears to be able to get around this spike protein mutation and still provide ample neutralizing antibody response. But where we are now in the United States is we have 3 vaccines, 2 of which are really quite good, remarkably good, both mRNA vaccines made by Moderna and Pfizer. With 2 doses, they offer better than 90% efficacy if you understand that because of the warp speed with which we've been developing vaccines, efficacy is being measured not as the ability to block transmission, but as the ability to prevent hospitalization and death. And so we could say, in a way, they've proved themselves to be, prophylactic therapeutics. We're still waiting the proof that they actually reduce transmission. Israel is ahead of everybody with the highest percentage of its population vaccinated, and they do see a dramatic reduction in cases, but we just don't have a way of tracking what's going on with the asymptomatic individuals who have been vaccinated. And so we're very worried as more variants emerge. We have a new one that's just emerged, just been recognized here in New York City in the last few days, and it appears to not only have the spike protein mutation similar to the South African variant, but also have a mutation that allows it to colonize with very high affinity ACE2 receptors in the nose, which might mean, I say might, I don't want to get ahead of the science here, it's all still getting figured out, but it might mean that individuals that have been vaccinated or are COVID survivors could be carriers, carrying virus that would colonize their nose, which is not an IgG immunoglobulin site, really. It's more IgE and IgA. So it may not provide protection against carriage and transmission. We're waiting to see and to figure it out. And of course, everyone's got their eyes on what's going on in Brazil with their variant, which has proven devastating in the Amazonas state and is spreading throughout Brazil right now, which is experiencing a great surge at this time. In the big picture, what should we be learning from all of this? Way back in August 2016, I was asked to give a presentation to Mike Bloomberg privately, and I made a few key predictions that I think we will see more outbreaks in the future. They will involve very, very profound antibiotic-resistant plasmids spreading multiple forms of resistance that will be cross-cutting against whole classes of antibiotics. We'll see more high virulence food crop pathogens. I'm sorry, it's jumping. That will go right to our world food supply in very dramatic ways. We'll have fully drug-resistant gonorrhea, syphilis, and other STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Climate change will hasten the emergence of diseases, and it will be hastened by microbial spread. For example, microbes that change the color of the ice, resulting in a reverse albedo effect, which makes the ice melt faster, and methane producing methanogens that also are emitting greenhouse gases at a far greater rate than, say, burning gasoline. I think we'll see far more diseases from bats. I predicted this several years ago, and now here we are with COVID, which is clearly a bat disease originally. I said we will have more diseases across Asia that involve wild bird and migratory birds, and in particular because the flyways are being affected by climate change. And that many of the old diseases that we've thought we had under control will outwit our armamentarium. Meanwhile, no one really governs pathogens. Nobody governs Earth biology. We're in the Anthropocene. We control the planet. One species controls everything, but it's not governed in any way. And in the absence of any kind of global governance, what we're seeing, we get hoarding of supplies, nationalistic responses, travel shutdowns, countries with poor laboratory capacities. We can't control human movements. People bring in the police and military. We get lies and social media fear mongering. And everybody's having a very hard time countering any of it, including already claims about dire outcomes from using vaccines. In the end, I think we're facing a situation where we honestly have the greatest challenge we have all collectively faced since the emergence of HIV in the 1980s. We blew that. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have a cure. We allowed it to become endemic in a host of African countries. And we are forever, until some miraculous scientific breakthrough occurs, we are forever in a north-south movement of resources, finances, and so on in order to keep HIV deaths at a minimum. But the spread of HIV continues. And I think COVID is showing us that, we've been guilty of great arrogance as a species, and especially those of us who live in the wealthy world. We thought our whole framework of global health was that it was about us taking care of them, the rich world taking care of the poor world, the Asian, Northern European world taking care of the global South, and this sort of patronizing, paternalistic view, or if you want to be cruel about it, you'd say a neo-colonial view. And all of our global health agencies have been set up accordingly. Well, look where we are now. The highest death toll is in the richest country in the world, my country, the United States of America, with now 520,000 dead. And we're going into a fourth surge. And none of the wealthy countries can stand up and wave their hands and say, hey, we did it. Even Norway has gone back on lockdown. Even Finland has gone back on lockdown. And we have a giant hubris problem, a giant problem of arrogance that needs to be conquered. And we need to get through this as a global community somehow. And ultimately, I go back to my opening remarks. We don't have a strategy. We don't have any agreed strategy. What is our strategic goal? Is our strategic goal just to get the rich world back and Wall Street back and the Hang Seng back and the global stock markets moving again? Is that our strategy? Is our strategy to allow this virus to become a permanent scourge in some parts of humanity while the wealthy world gets off scot-free with constantly updated vaccines? Or is our strategy something bolder, more dramatic, that requires a much larger commitment of resources and sharing and global governance than we have previously attempted? And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such a comprehensive, and it's just having a big question laid out. And then I think a lot of people have questions, but let me pose first question. You said, transition to Biden administration, you see more decisive, moves and actions. And from your view, what is exactly still you see as challenges or concern, even the change of administration taking more vigorously on this COVID-19? What do you see? What do you see concerns and challenges from your view?
Well, the United States has not been as deeply divided socially and politically as we are now anytime since the American Civil War. We have an inability to agree on anything. We can't agree on what a virus is. We can't agree on whether COVID is something to worry about, something to be afraid of. We can't agree on anything, and our political leadership is divided right down the middle. The Democrats, Biden and his Democrat Party, control the Senate by one deciding vote, and that's the vice president breaking ties. Our House has a stronger level of support from the Democrats, but it's still a small enough margin that if 10 or 15 Democrats decide to break with their leadership, they can't pass a bill. Across the nation, we have a patchwork of responses. There's no two states that are fighting the disease the same way. We have no real national policy. I mean, I think it's probably quite shocking if you're in Japan and you have never been in America before. It would be very shocking for you to see how haphazard our response is. Because, you know, Japan famously has a national health system that's one of the greatest universal health systems on the planet. And you famously have a system that has centralized authority, that where, you know, from Tokyo can come instructions that each prefect might do things a little differently depending on the politics of the leader, but basically they're going to follow a model that's laid out from the center. We have the exact opposite. Our health system was originally set up as a local city level response. You can actually travel inside of some states, and as you go from county to county, there's different laws about public health. You know, one county might say nobody can sell chicken without a certain kind of test for salmonella, and the next county doesn't care. Go ahead, sell your chicken. And now we come in with a crisis that really requires a national response. You can't beat COVID in one county. You can't beat COVID in one city, and you can't beat it in one state. It must be tackled by the whole world. And certainly as America, it must be tackled by the whole nation. And yet we're so deeply divided in everything that we cannot come up with a uniform response. And the Biden administration is trying very, very hard. He has an enormous amount of support. His latest poll shows he's got 63% approval rating from the American people right now. But he can't squander that. All his popularity rests on tackling COVID. And if we go into now a fourth surge, and it goes very fast because of variant viruses, such as has been the case in the UK, we could be in really deep, deep trouble that's not just about the pandemic, but also political.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions I just read from question column. So this is from Tom O'Sullivan. Could you comment on President Biden's decision overnight to use Defense Procurement Act to manufacture vaccines? Merrick, is this something other countries should be doing?
So even when he was just a candidate, Joe Biden said, we're in a war. And he has used military metaphors to describe the fight against COVID. So it comes no surprise that he would invoke what we call the Defense Production Act. Under this act, which really came originally from a World War II experience, if I have time, I can give you a quick anecdote because it's quite interesting. In World War II, we had a company that was making a fighter jet that was meant to be a fast strategic fighter jet that would protect the big bombers. Of course, Germany was bombing the heck out of England. And Churchill was desperate for these fighter jets that were called Mustangs to come to the UK and defend against German bombing and the Blitz. They discovered, however, that while it was aerodynamically brilliantly designed, this Mustang jet had crappy engines. They were terrible. The jet would soar and then suddenly stall and start, heading to the ground. But the British the Jaguar company made a really great engine. And so Churchill appealed directly to FDR and said, let's just put all these patent agreements and, manufacturer problems aside, and we'll put the Jaguar engine in your American Mustangs, and we'll be able to defeat the German Air Force. And, all our American Air Force said, no, 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 you can't do that. And the British Air Force, no, 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 you can't do that. But FDR and Churchill knew the wisdom of it. And it was a decisive turning point. What we see today in our war being our main sort of fighter jet being vaccines is that the big manufacturers of vaccines, Johnson & Johnson / Janssen, Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca, all of them, and Sinovac from China, all of them have production problems. These are not easy vaccines to make. And of course, the mRNA ones are really a challenge because it's an altogether new technology. And making those liposome constructs, these tiny little fat balls that they put the RNA inside of, those little fat balls require special filtration systems and so on that are microscopic. And, really one little contamination event and the whole production line has to stop. So meanwhile, there are other vaccine makers who were trying to come up with a COVID vaccine and then their phase 1 or 2 trials failed. So they have production capacity, but nothing to produce. So the first one that stepped forward and said, we're willing to help out was Merck. And Merck, of course, is the second largest pharmaceutical manufacturer in the world. And they stepped forward and said, we're willing to help. And Biden imposed the Defense Production Act to basically say to Johnson & Johnson, put your patent issues aside, release the details to Merck so that Merck can now manufacture vaccine. And I think we're going to see the pressure come down, country after country, on pharmaceutical companies, telling them, look, this is no time to fall back on your patent, excuses. We've got people dying in the streets out here. Come on, let's get these vaccines moving. And I think we'll see far more dramatic collaborative agreements coming forward.
Okay, for a couple questions. So I will combine questions. I will list 2 questions now. The one question is, in your view, can COVAX facility evolve to be an insufficient functional platform upon which vaccination in developing countries can rely? Another one is, can Japan, in your view, what do you think would be possible for Japan to hold the Olympic Games this summer?
I have my Olympics pin already. I'm counting on it. And certainly there are athletes all over the world that are hoping it will happen, but it's going to be very challenging, especially if the variants do in fact become the dominant strains circulating. And that looks, to our Tony Fauci, a name that may be familiar to most of you, is our top scientific advisor on COVID to the president. And he is predicting that by the end of March, so just 4 weeks from now, the B117 variant will be the dominant new infection for people acquiring COVID in the United States. Now, the good news about B117 is so far, all 3 of our vaccines seem to do okay against tackling B117. But that's not the same, that's not true with the other variants. And anybody who thinks that we've seen every variant this virus is going to throw at us is naive in the extreme. This virus is mutating, and we're exerting selection pressure on it. We're pushing evolution in this viral population with monoclonal antibodies, with inadequately treated patients who carry virus for weeks in their bodies, and possibly with some optimal vaccines that we try to rush through from one country after another that may not perform as well as their respective manufacturers claim. So that could be the thing that kills the Olympics for Japan. I mean, I think if everything were stagnant, you know, if the virus wasn't evolving, that's a big if, right? If I see Kurokawa-san laughing, if the virus weren't evolving, then we would be able to confidently say that Japan's cluster identification policy, coupled with rolling out vaccine, could in fact make Japan a safe place for visitors, and that requiring vaccination of all athletes and everybody coming to the games, and requiring multiple nucleic acid tests could ensure a relatively or perhaps perfectly safe games. But we're not dealing with a stagnant enemy. We're dealing with a very constantly changing enemy with new weapons, dodging our bullets. The first question, oh, remind me, what was it?
It was about the COVAX facility. Do you think it's...
Oh, COVAX. So COVAX, this is, I think, the one truly inspiring, hopeful thing in the global health panorama right now. For those who aren't familiar, COVAX is an acronym for a facility set up combined by World Health Organization, Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, UNICEF, the World Bank, and CEPI, which is the Epidemic Preparedness Group. And the intent is to create a vast pool of vaccine that can go to countries that do not have their own manufacturing capacity, and particularly countries that are in the bottom 50 poorest nations on Earth, and to facilitate full vaccination planet-wide. I think COVAX is great. I think the fact it exists is remarkable. However, it is grossly underfunded. I mean, it hasn't even come close to reaching its initial financing target set out last summer. And now that the vaccines are actually there and it's time to really roll them out, the funding targets are much greater. It needs billions and billions and billions of dollars, and it's got millions and millions and millions. It's off by a log scale.
Great. With that, let me go to Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, who would like to comment in the end.
Okay, Laurie, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation and discussion. Very inspiring and analytical, as usual. That's your style. In fact, I think I have been also working on the 10th year of Fukushima right now, coming next month. And so many inquiries and sort of sessions imposed upon me. And there's a big sort of one-page media just press yesterday on my reflection of this 10 years in Fukushima. What do we have learned, and is there any change in Japanese politics in this regard? But now it's coming again with the corona issue. So I'm sitting also another committee in Japan, but I think your insight is always inspiring and give me some of us sort of food for thoughts. And thank you very much, and just stay in touch. I'm just looking forward for this Noguchi Hideo thing, which may happen somewhere in Tunisia later next 2 years or so. I'm very much looking forward to furthering our collaboration. And thank you very much. Again, stay in touch. Thank you.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much. Yeah, with that, we came to a time for today's session. And I'd like to, again, thank Laurie for giving us time, giving your, the very talented, views and everything. And we're very much inspired. And thank you very much again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating. Thank you.